we're going to talk about the rise of militarist Japan and how America is accelerating it. So it says here that the shadow behind the rising sun, what you should know about Japan's first female prime minister, a lot of the right-wingers are just gushing over this woman like she's some sort of a hero. All she is doing is the bidding of the United States. She is all for accelerating Japanese militarism. She's all for intensifying Japanese purchases of American military technology. And the Americans are all for it because that boosts up the American military-industrial complex, and it also boosts up Japan as an American proxy against the Chinese and the North Koreans. So people are talking about, oh, yes, this is Japanese nationalism, and it is, but it's not Japanese independence. It's more like America is yet again creating another Japanese Leviathan. So let's get into this article, and I'll give you guys my commentary on this. So it says here that behind Sanei Takaichi's nationalist swagger lies a country still marching to U.S. orders. So it says here that behind the triumphant rhetoric of self-reliance lies a more complicated reality. Takaichi's rise marks not Japan's emancipation from post-war constraints, but the deepening of its strategic alignment with Washington's Indo-Pacific design. Her Japan seeks sovereignty, yet moves within American lines. That's because Japan is occupied by the United States. There's around, I want to say, 56,000 or so American troops in Japan. That is an occupation. Japan has been militarily occupied since the end of World War II. That's quite obvious. So Japan is going to do the bidding of the United States. Now, America is working to boost up Japan's military capacity, and America wants Japan to increase its military spending to 5% of its GDP, which would be humongous and would make Japan into a massive military power. And that would mean Japan being a very serious threat to the Chinese and the North Koreans, which is what the Americans want. The question is, what is this Leviathan going to do once it's unleashed by the Americans? Is it going to do its own thing? Is it going to do another Nanking type atrocity or a series of Nanking atrocities? And that's what I fear will happen if Japan revives as a East Asian power again. I think it is. I think it definitely is reviving at the behest of the United States, albeit it is reviving. Now, remember what the Japanese did to China. They killed millions of people in China. No one ever talks about it, but that's another dark fact of World War II. Japan slaughtered literally millions of people in China. And so America wants to use this country called Japan to go against China. And they want the Japanese to repeat Nanking yet again. That's what the Americans want. The Americans don't give a damn what atrocities the Japanese may do. So it says here that Japan must stand proud again, yet this pride is modeled on a blueprint Washington knows well. A Japan that is stronger, but in ways that serve the larger American strategy in Asia. China was quick to notice. Japan, and this is what the Chinese had to say, quote, Japan should reflect on its history and remember the lessons so that it would not repeat past mistakes of war, meaning Japan don't do Nanking again. Said Lim Jian, the spokesperson for Japan's foreign ministry. The warning hinted at what Tokyo's neighbors suspect, that Japan's new independence may in fact be a return to old allegiances, this time under an American flag. So the Chinese are worried about a rising Japan. This is a fact. Now you could say, well, Japan is so small. It's much smaller than China. Why would China be afraid? Well, Japan has always been smaller than China, and it was smaller than China during World War II, and yet it was able to invade China and butcher millions. Never underestimate a small country. If it were the case that size really matters in a war, then stop complaining about Israel and stop saying that Israel is a threat to the Middle East, because Israel is the smallest fucking country in the Middle East, and yet everyone complains about Israel nonstop. So really, spare me with the uneducated observations. So it says here, at the heart of her agenda is a promise to restore Japan's full right to defend itself, and when necessary, to strike first. So Japan wants to get involved in the business of preemptive strikes. For years, they've talked about self-defense, but they really want to do a preemptive strike. That would mean attacking China, attacking North Korea. She has vowed to revise Article 9 of the Constitution, the clause that has bound the country to pacifism since World War II, to expand China's right to collective self-defense. In practical terms, that means moving beyond a purely defensive posture towards a strategy of deterrence and even preemption. The shift began under Shinzo Abe, blah, blah, blah. Japan is acquiring and developing long-range strike capabilities, including U.S.-made Tomahawk cruise missiles and AGM-158 JASSM systems, as well as its own Type 12 missiles, whose range has been extended to nearly 1,000 kilometers. That would mean Japan having the capability of bombing China. The Izumo-class helicopter destroyers, which is a giant naval ship, by the way, are being converted to deploy F-35B stealth fighters, while new investments pour into cyber and space defense programs. Oh, and by the way, Japan is also working on creating its own fifth-generation fighter jet to be more militarily independent from the American military-industrial complex. Now, keep in mind, America is creating a monster. It's creating a Japanese monster. You could say, well, there's no historical precedence for this. There is, actually, because it was the United States who created Imperial Japan. This is a fact of history that almost no one talks about, but it's the truth. Remember, Japan was in a state of isolation for about 400 years. It did not get involved in other countries. It locked itself from other countries, from foreign influence. And the reason for this was because Japan wanted nothing to do with Christianity. It didn't like the fact that you had missionaries from Portugal who were preaching the gospel in Japan. A lot of Japanese people converted to Catholicism. That led to an actual war between Japanese Catholic samurai and Japanese Shinto samurai. The Catholics actually stood their ground for a while. The Dutch intervened, gave cannons to the Shintoists to bomb the Catholics, and the Catholics were defeated. After this war was over, Japan said, we will no longer allow any sort of foreign influence on our country because we do not want Christianity in Japan. Then, so Japan commenced its era of total isolation from the rest of the world, and that isolation lasted for about, I want to say, 400 years or so. Lasted for centuries. And for centuries, Japan was away from the world. It lived a primitive life. It was just a bunch of samurais killing each other. You had feudal lords who were warring with each other. And that was that. They were just killing each other. So America said, well, here's an untapped market. America went to Japan, and you had Mr. Perry go to Japan with a giant coal-powered naval ship. And he told the Japanese to buy American military technology. And the Japanese said, we're not interested. And Mr. Perry said, fire the cannons. The Americans fired the cannons. The Japanese were terrified. They never saw anything like this in their lives. And Japan said, where do we sign? So the Americans began to sell, by force, military technology to the Japanese. Thus commenced the Meiji era of Japan. The Meiji era of Japan begins in the 19th century and is basically the era of Japan going through a process of unification. This led to the destruction of the samurai culture because the samurai were people who were resisting westernization. And so the samurai had to be crushed. This is what the whole film, The Last Samurai, was about. And so the samurai was crushed, and you had the full unification of Japan under one government and under one emperor. Japan rose as a military power, and Japan entered the world of realpolitik against the Chinese. This is where things really get interesting. Japan commences its process of becoming a major superpower in Asia. So what happens? China and Japan start fighting over who's going to control North Korea. North Korea was divided between two factions, kind of like today, North and South Korea. The two factions were the pro-Japan camp and the pro-China camp. The pro-Japan camp was a proxy of the Japanese. The pro-China camp was a proxy of, well, China. And eventually there was a riot that broke out in Japan. Basically, the wife of the King of Korea, the King of Korea was King Gojong, I believe. His wife was very corrupt, and she was involved in some sort of a scheme, or I think her brother or cousin or whoever was involved in some sort of a scheme to steal rice that was supposed to be allocated to the Korean soldiers. So they used to pay the soldiers in rice. Well, that rice was embezzled out, and then they gave the Korean soldiers bags of sand. The Korean soldiers said, what the fuck? And they rioted, and they attacked some Japanese Japanese soldiers who were stationed in Korea at the time. Japan sent soldiers to Korea. China sent soldiers to Korea as a response to protect the pro-China camp. Now, this is from my own memory. I don't remember everything. I could be wrong about my history, but this is what I remember the history saying. So the king of Korea was pro-China. The government of Korea was pro-Japan. So you had Chinese troops in Korea, you had Japanese troops in Korea, and they were on the verge to fighting over who was going to control Korea. Korea was very important for Japan because if I'm not mistaken, Korea had a lot of natural resources that Japan wanted. I think it was iron or something like that. But regardless, Japan wanted to control Korea. So China and Japan were on the verge of going to war over Korea. They decided to de-escalate things, and they said, "Let's not go to war. Let's make a pact. Let's make an agreement." And the agreement said that neither Japan nor China would ever send troops into Korea. That was the agreement. Eventually, a riot broke out again, and Japan decides to send soldiers to Korea. I believe the pro-Japan camp in Korea said, "Hey, Japan, could you send some soldiers?" Japan sends soldiers to Korea. China says, "You broke the agreement." "Sorry, Japan, you broke the agreement." And China, in response, began to send soldiers into Korea. Thus began the First Sino-Japanese War in the late 1800s. 1899, I believe, the First Sino-Japanese War ended. So then what happened? Japan defeats China because Japan had that American military technology. And the war was over Korea. They were killing each other in Korea. They weren't killing each other in China or Japan. They were killing each other in Korea. Japan defeats China, solidifying Japan's position as a regional superpower in East Asia. Japan puts a military presence in China. Russia says, "Hey, China, you gotta back off. Back off, China." Germany, France, Russia collectively tell Japan to back off. Japan backs off. Russia puts a naval presence in China. The Americans don't like this because America doesn't like Russia, nor does it like China. So Japan says, "Man, we just got kicked out of China after defeating China. What kind of victory is this?" So Japan says, "We're not going to let Russia just be this dominating power and push us around." So what happens? Japan does a surprise attack on Russia's naval base in China. Their naval base was called Port Arthur. They attack Russia at Port Arthur, and thus begins the first Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. The entire world thought that Japan was going to lose. So all you people saying Japan ain't shit, I got news for you. You're uneducated. I'm trying to help you, but you're uneducated. Anyone who tells me that Japan ain't shit is not educated. Japan has been a serious power for a very long time. So the whole world thought there's no way that Japan could beat Russia because Russia had a very advanced navy. Russia was a white country, still is a white country. Japan was a non-white country. And so the belief at that time was there's no way that a non-white country could defeat a white country. Well, everyone got shocked because Japan ended up defeating the Russians. And there was a massive battle between the Russians and the Japanese called the Battle of Mukden. 90,000 Russians were slaughtered in the Battle of Mukden. Now, I think you would be very hard-pressed to find a battle in the history of modern warfare where 90,000 people were butchered in a single battle. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find that. The Americans were watching from afar, and the Americans said, "Wow, this is really good." Theodore Roosevelt sends a letter saying, "I was pro-Japan after watching Japan defeat China, but now I'm even more pro-Japan after watching Japan defeat Russia." So the history of America using the Japanese to go against the Chinese and the Russians has been going on for a very long time. You can go back to Theodore Roosevelt. The history of America creating a militarily powerful Japan goes back a very long way. It goes back to the 1800s with the Meiji era. So what happens after Russia is defeated? Japan says, we've defeated China. We've defeated Russia. We are the dominating power. We are a superpower that must be taken seriously. And we are going to be taken seriously. And so the next target of Japan was Korea. We defeated China over who was going to control Korea. We defeated Russia. Korea. What does the American government do under Theodore Roosevelt? The Americans tell the Europeans who had soldiers stationed in Korea, withdraw your troops. America withdrew its troops from Korea. The Europeans withdrew, at the behest of America, the Europeans withdrew their troops from Korea. Why did America do this? Because the Americans wanted Japan to invade Korea. Why? Because the Americans wanted a powerful Korea in Asia to use as a chess piece against the Chinese and the Russians. This is a fact of history no one talks about. No one talks about this. Nobody talks about this. Okay. So Korea says, oh my God, Japan is going to invade us. The king of Korea sends a telegram to America saying, Theodore Roosevelt, please help us. Why? Get this. Because America made an agreement, a security agreement with the Koreans, that if any external power ever threatened the integrity of Korea's territory, that America would intervene. Diplomatically, albeit it would intervene. So the king of Korea tells America, hey, America, we have an agreement. Japan is going to invade us. You have to help us. America completely ignores the king of Korea. The king of Korea is forced to flee. Japan invades. And Japan invades, takes over Korea, solidifying the Japanese empire. And that was the beginning of the Japanese empire. That was the beginning of Imperial Japan. Who created Imperial Japan? America did. Japan ended up attacking the United States. But nonetheless, it was America who created Imperial Japan. That's a fact of history. So what is America doing right now? Creating a powerful Japan. The United States wants Japan not merely as an ally, but as a forward operating partner whose rearmament fits seamlessly into the American strategic framework in Asia. Jeffrey Sachs argues, the U.S. acts as if Japan needs to be defended against China. Let's have a look. During the past 1,000 years, how many times did China attempt to invade Japan? If you answered 0, you are correct. Migrants account for barely 2% of Japan's population, yet what do we see in Japan? Anti-migrant sentiment, anti-foreign sentiment. Nationalism is rising in Japan. That's what's happening. Nationalism is rising like crazy in Japan. We have never seen anti-foreigner sentiment like this in Japan in the entirety of the post-World War II era. And we see all these American tourists causing problems in Japan. They're like dancing in subways all the time. They're doing graffiti. I saw this Australian guy who was stealing bottles of alcohol on tombstones, because in Japan they have a tradition where they put bottles of Kirin, and they put bottles or cans of alcohol on tombstones to show respect to the dead. And you have this Australian guy going to random tombstones, graveyards in Japan, just stealing alcohol and drinking it and guzzling it down. Blatant disrespect, blatant provocation. I wouldn't be surprised if these people are plants to revive nationalism, but nationalism is reviving in Japan as a result of this. So anti-China sentiment is huge, anti-foreign sentiment is huge, and that's why the far right in Japan is rising like crazy. Sohei Kamiya, this guy here, is rising like crazy. And it says here that he is the Secretary General of the ultra-nationalist Sansei Party. And Sansei Party is a far-right, nationalist, anti-China, militaristic party that's rising in Japan. And it says here that this guy said, why do foreigners come first when the Japanese are struggling to make ends meet and suffering from fear? And it says here that Washington has pressed Japan to spend up to 5% of its GDP on defense, more than double its current trajectory, as part of a broader push for burden sharing. The phrase sounds cooperative, but in practice it means underwriting America's Indo-Pacific strategy, and that strategy is boosting Japan's military strength against the Chinese. The stronger Japan becomes militarily, the more it seems bound to Washington's orbit. And so Japan is still a major trading partner with China, but America wants to end this. We are creating another Japanese monster. And so America wants to see a third Sino-Japanese war.